The 1st of May, 1943. Somewhere over the Bay of Biscay, at roughly 25,000 feet, a Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress is coming apart. Not quickly. Not in the sudden, merciful way of a direct hit that turns a bomber into a brief orange smear against the gray Atlantic sky. This is something slower, and in its way, far worse. Fire has taken hold in two places at once, the radio compartment and the waist section, and the flames are spreading through the bones of the aircraft, melting aluminum, igniting ammunition, eating through the very skin of the fuselage. The oxygen system has been shot out. The control cables are severed. 3 of the 10 men aboard have already jumped into the freezing ocean below, deciding that the sea offered better odds than what they were watching happen inside that plane. In the rear of the aircraft, left almost entirely alone, is a man named Maynard Harrison Smith. His crewmates call him Snuffy. They do not mean it as a compliment. If you've never heard this story before, you are in for something extraordinary. Subscribe and hit the bell. Every week we bring you the moments of the Second World War that the textbooks forgot. Maynard Smith is 31 years old on this particular morning, which makes him a decade older than most of the men he flies with. He is 5 feet 4 inches tall, weighing perhaps 130 pounds. He has a grey pallor to him, a protrusive Adam's apple, and the perpetually aggrieved expression of a man who believes the world has consistently failed to appreciate him. He has been at the base at Thurley, Bedfordshire, for roughly 6 weeks. In that time he has made almost no friends. He has spent the majority of his evenings at pubs in nearby Bedford, holding court with whoever would listen, dispensing opinions on subjects ranging from military strategy to the shortcomings of his superior officers. His fellow airmen in the 423rd Bombardment Squadron of the 306th Bomb Group have given him the nickname Snuffy, borrowed from the cartoon strip Barney Google, specifically from a short, shiftless, and comprehensively obnoxious character in that strip. There is something important to understand about Maynard Smith's presence at Thurley at all. He did not enlist out of patriotic fervor. He was not moved by the fall of France or the bombing of Pearl Harbor to put down whatever he was doing and go fight for his country. He was arrested in Michigan for failing to pay child support for a child he had abandoned, and a judge gave him a straightforward choice: prison or the United States Army. He chose the Army, was funneled into basic training at 31 alongside men not yet out of their teens, and immediately developed a fierce resentment for the entire institution. He volunteered for aerial gunnery school not out of a love of flying or combat but because he understood that aerial gunners held the rank of non-commissioned officer at minimum, which meant more pay and more authority than the alternatives. He qualified, was assigned as a ball turret gunner, a position suited to men of small frame, and was shipped across the Atlantic to England in March of 1943, where he promptly resumed the behavior that had defined his life to that point. He was, by any reasonable accounting, exactly the sort of man you would not want beside you in a crisis. Stubborn, argumentative, contemptuous of authority, unable or unwilling to function within the social fabric of a military unit. His pilot, First Lieutenant Lewis Johnson, had been flying combat missions over Europe since the autumn of 1942. On this 1st of May, he was flying his 25th and final mission before rotating home. He needed a ball turret gunner to complete his crew. He got Maynard Smith. To understand what happens next, you need to understand the place they were flying toward, and what the 306th Bomb Group had already endured to get there. The 306th had arrived in England from Boise, Idaho, in the autumn of 1942, and they had been at war continuously since October of that year. They called themselves the Reich Wreckers. On the 27th of January, 1943, they had been part of the first American bomber force to strike a target inside Germany itself, hitting the port facilities at Wilhelmshaven. From that mission forward they bore another designation, First over Germany, with the particular grim pride that belongs to men who have survived something most people cannot imagine. By the spring of 1943, the strategic bombing campaign against Nazi-occupied Europe was entering a phase of intense and bloody attrition. The 8th Air Force, operating out of bases across East Anglia and Bedfordshire, was flying missions 2 and sometimes 3 times a week against industrial targets, transportation hubs, and, crucially, the German U-boat infrastructure that was strangling Allied shipping in the Atlantic. The Battle of the Atlantic was not yet won. German submarines were still sinking Allied vessels at a rate that alarmed the planners in Washington and London. The pens where those submarines were serviced, repaired, and launched were among the highest priority targets in the European theater. Saint-Nazaire, on the Bay of Biscay in the Loire-Atlantique region of western France, was one of those pens. And it was one of the most dangerous pieces of real estate in occupied Europe. The Germans understood perfectly well what the U-boat pens represented strategically, and they had built the defenses at Saint-Nazaire accordingly. The pens themselves were massive reinforced concrete structures. The roofs alone were up to 8 meters thick in places, capable of absorbing direct hits from the bombs then available to American and British aircraft. Destroying the pens outright was essentially impossible. The goal was to damage the support infrastructure, disrupt operations, and degrade the capacity of the facility. To accomplish even this, the bombers had to fly directly into a concentration of anti-aircraft guns that Allied aircrews had come to know by a simple, honest name, Flak City. The standard approach route from Thurley to Saint-Nazaire carried the formation across the English Channel, down the western edge of the Breton Peninsula, passing within range of the heavily defended ports at Lorient and Brest, before turning south toward the target. Every mile of that route was contested. German fighter controllers had long since mapped the standard American approach corridors, and Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s were scrambled and positioned accordingly. The flak over Saint-Nazaire itself was dense enough that returning crews described it as a physical substance through which the aircraft had to push. On the morning of the 1st of May, 78 B-17 Flying Fortresses were dispatched from bases across eastern England to strike Saint-Nazaire. The 306th contributed 18 of those aircraft. Lieutenant Johnson's crew, B-17F tail number 42-29649, departed Thurley at approximately 3 in the morning local time, climbed into the pre-dawn darkness over Bedfordshire, and joined the formation heading south and west toward France. In the ball turret, a glass and metal sphere roughly 4 feet in diameter that hung beneath the fuselage between the bomb bay and the tail, Maynard Smith was flying his first combat mission. The ball turret was not considered a desirable posting. The gunner entered through a hatch in the aircraft's belly, sat in a fetal position with knees drawn up and feet braced against the gun mounts, and operated 2 50-caliber machine guns that could traverse through a wide arc below and to the sides of the aircraft. It was cramped, cold, isolated, and thoroughly exposed. There was nothing between the gunner and the sky below except a curved sheet of plexiglass, perhaps an inch thick, and the knowledge that the mechanisms holding the turret in place were doing their job. At altitude, temperatures inside the ball turret could fall well below -40 degrees Fahrenheit. At altitude, if the hydraulic system failed, the turret could become locked in any position, including one where the hatch was inaccessible, trapping the gunner inside. Men who had done the arithmetic on their situation did not typically enjoy it. Smith, as he later recounted, was not particularly troubled by any of this. He had a specific, limited quality that distinguished him from the other things that could be said about him. He was not afraid of much. The mission began to go wrong before the bombers reached their target. Cloud cover over Saint-Nazaire frustrated the bombing effort. Of the 78 fortresses dispatched, only 29 were ultimately effective on the primary target. The remaining aircraft made individual decisions, some bombing secondary or last resort targets, some carrying their bomb loads home. The lead navigator of one of the formation elements made an error in the cloud, turning east too early over the Breton Peninsula, and at least part of the force found itself approaching the city of Brest at relatively low altitude, approximately 2,000 feet, exposed and vulnerable, over a city that was itself heavily armed and patrolled by German fighters. The Germans at Brest were faster to respond than those at Saint-Nazaire. Anti-aircraft fire came up immediately. German fighters scrambled. 2 fortresses were shot out of the sky in the approach to Brest, tumbling away with their crews still aboard. Lieutenant Johnson pushed his aircraft through the fire and turned toward the English Channel. It was on the homeward leg, somewhere over the Bay of Biscay, that B-17 tail number 42-29649 caught fire. A burst of cannon fire from a Focke-Wulf 190. Cannon shells struck the aircraft in multiple places simultaneously. The oxygen system was hit and rendered inoperable. Several control cables were cut, and fire ignited in 2 locations at once. In the radio compartment, amidships, and in the waist section just aft of the radio room. Both fires spread quickly. Up front, in the cockpit, Lieutenant Johnson had a crippled aircraft that was still flying, barely. He maintained control and held course for England. He had no way to know what was happening behind him. What was happening behind him was this. The radio operator, Technical Sergeant Harry Bean, opened the door to the radio compartment, saw the fire, put on his parachute, and jumped into the ocean. Waist gunners Joseph Bukacek and Robert Folliard made the same calculation and followed him out. 3 men, gone in less than a minute. In the waist section, the fires burned. Maynard Smith climbed out of the ball turret. He came out of the turret to find himself isolated in the rear half of an aircraft that was, in the most literal sense, on fire around him. The men who had been there were gone. The radio compartment ahead of him was burning. The waist section where he stood was burning. The tail gunner, Staff Sergeant Roy Gibson, had been hit in the back and was bleeding badly, painfully crawling forward out of the burning tail toward the center of the aircraft. Smith had options. The 3 men who had just jumped had made a rational choice. The aircraft was seriously damaged, seriously on fire, and they were over water in an area where rescue was at least theoretically possible. The parachute and the water represented a known risk. The burning B-17 represented something much harder to assess. The rational calculation pointed toward the hatch. Smith did not make the rational calculation. He would later say, with the practical brevity that occasionally broke through his habitual grandiosity, that the aircraft seemed to still be flying level, which suggested that Lieutenant Johnson was still at the controls up front. If Johnson was there, Smith reasoned, there was still something worth saving. He decided to stay. He wrapped a sweater around his face to protect his eyes and throat from the smoke and heat. He grabbed a fire extinguisher. And he went to work on the radio compartment. The fire there was already established, fed by fuel and oxygen and the accumulated combustibles of a working aircraft, paper documents, insulation, electrical wiring, the wooden and rubber components of the radio equipment itself. The extinguisher slowed it, beat it back. Smith worked methodically, pressing forward, directing the chemical foam at the base of the flames. The fire was not out, but it was reduced. Then he heard Gibson. The tail gunner had been shot through the back. The wound appeared to involve his left lung. Gibson was bleeding into the chest cavity, and if he was allowed to lie on his right side, the blood would drain into his right lung and he would drown in his own fluid. Smith understood this, or intuited it. He dragged Gibson away from the burning tail, turned him onto his left side to let the blood pool in the already compromised lung rather than the functioning one, administered a shot of morphine from the aircraft's medical kit, and made him as comfortable as the circumstances permitted. Then he picked up the fire extinguisher and went back to the fire. What happened next is documented in the official Medal of Honor citation, in Lieutenant Johnson's mission report, in Andy Rooney's reporting for Stars and Stripes, and in the accounts of crew members who survived to tell it. All of these sources agree on the essential facts. For the next approximately 90 minutes, Maynard Smith held the rear of that aircraft together by himself. The fires in the radio compartment and waist section did not go out easily. They were fed by aviation fuel from punctured lines, by the aircraft's own structure, by the stored ammunition that the heat was beginning to cook off in the nearby ammunition boxes. The fire extinguishers ran out. When they did, Smith found another method. He threw the burning debris out of the aircraft, shoving it through the holes that the fire had already melted in the fuselage skin, or pushing it out through the waist gun apertures. Ammunition boxes that were beginning to detonate from the heat went out the same way. He was throwing exploding material out of a moving aircraft with his bare hands. When German fighters came back, and they did come back, multiple times over that 90-minute period, Smith dropped whatever he was doing, moved to whichever waist gun was in the best position, and fired. Then he went back to the fire. Then another fighter appeared and he went back to the guns. The flight report Johnson filed afterward noted that Smith had manned both waist guns during the running battle home, moving between them as the angles demanded. At some point during this period, when the fire extinguishers were completely exhausted and the flames in the waist section were still burning, Smith employed an expedient that would become the most memorably undignified detail of his citation. He urinated on the fire. It is a measure of how close to catastrophe the situation had become that this was not a desperate gesture but a practical one. Liquid was liquid, and he used what was available. This story is exactly what this channel exists to tell. If you want more like it, the ones that fell through the cracks of the official histories, subscribe now, and leave a comment below with a moment in the Second World War that you think deserves its own video. Somewhere ahead of the burning rear section, through the sealed door of the bomb bay, Lieutenant Johnson was flying an aircraft whose rear half he could not see and whose condition he did not fully know. He knew they had taken catastrophic damage. He knew the oxygen system was gone. He knew the control cables were compromised. What he did not know was that there was one man in the back who had decided, with no audience and no expectation of recognition, that he was going to hold the thing together. The fires continued to consume the aircraft's structure even as Smith fought them. The aluminum skin of the fuselage began to distort and fail in places where the heat had been most intense. Smith recognized that the structure might not survive a normal landing, and he began doing something else, throwing out everything in the rear section that was not bolted down. Weight reduction. Every pound removed was one less pound the weakened structure had to absorb on impact. He threw it all, equipment, spent casings, anything loose, through the holes already present in the fuselage skin. Through the long, battered hours of the homeward flight, Roy Gibson lay on the floor of the waist section, kept alive by the morphine and by Smith's decision to position him correctly on that cold aluminum floor. The fires burned lower and then lower still, beaten down by the extinguishers and the thrown debris and the improvised measures that Smith applied with the focused desperation of a man who is committed to a course of action and is not going to change his mind. The English coastline eventually appeared. The English Channel, then the cliffs, then the fields of Cornwall below. Smith was still there. RAF Predannock, Cornwall, sits near the southwestern tip of England, a wartime airfield carved into the headland above the Lizard Peninsula. It was not the 306th home base at Thurley. It was simply the first friendly runway that appeared. Lieutenant Johnson brought B-17 tail number 42-29649 down toward Predannock with the practiced care of a pilot who has made 24 previous landings and knows, on this 25th, that the aircraft beneath him is not well. He had reduced altitude as early as he could to give any surviving crew members in the rear access to breathable air. At lower altitudes, the damaged oxygen system was less critical because the atmosphere itself had enough oxygen to sustain life. He did not know if the gesture had done anyone any good. The landing, by all accounts, was smooth. Johnson touched the aircraft down, and for a moment, with the wheels on the ground and the engines throttling back, it seemed as though the worst was behind them. Then the fuselage broke in half. The heat damage to the aircraft's midsection had weakened the aluminum structure beyond what the forces of landing could absorb. As the B-17 slowed, the bond between the front and rear sections gave way, and the tail separated from the forward fuselage. The aircraft that had flown from Bedfordshire, taken fire over the Bay of Biscay, and been hit by more than 3,500 bullets and pieces of shrapnel according to subsequent counts, came to rest in two pieces on a Royal Air Force airfield in Cornwall. The men aboard it were, with one exception, alive. Roy Gibson, the tail gunner, had survived. The morphine and Smith's field positioning had gotten him through the flight. The crew members who had remained forward, protected from the worst of the fire by the bomb bay bulkhead, were unharmed. Lieutenant Johnson walked away from his 25th and final mission. And Maynard Smith climbed out of the wreckage of the rear section, smoke-stained, burned on his hands and face, having spent the last 90 minutes doing things that defied any reasonable expectation of what a man in his position could or would do. Andy Rooney was at Predannock that day. He was 24 years old, working as a correspondent for the Army newspaper Stars and Stripes, and he was at the airfield for reasons unrelated to what had just arrived. He saw the broken bomber. He spoke to the crew. He wrote a story. The story ran on the front page. To understand what the Army did with Maynard Smith's story, you need to understand the particular pressures bearing on the American military's public relations apparatus in the spring of 1943. The strategic bombing campaign had been in progress for the better part of a year, and it was costing the 8th Air Force heavily. The losses were not abstractions. They were young men, trained at enormous expense, flying aircraft that had also been built at enormous expense, and they were dying at rates that made the arithmetic of sustainable operations genuinely uncertain. The men who planned and executed the bombing campaign believed in what they were doing, believed that the systematic destruction of German industrial capacity would eventually end the war and save more lives than it cost. But belief and proof were not the same thing, and the proof was not yet available. The Medal of Honor had been awarded only once before to a living enlisted man in the 8th Air Force's European operations. Smith, if his actions merited the decoration, would be the first living enlisted recipient of the Medal of Honor in the European theater. The Army understood immediately what this meant. A living recipient was a story that could be told repeatedly, a face that could be put on a cause, a human embodiment of the argument that the sacrifices being made over Europe were worth the cost. Lieutenant Johnson's mission report was unambiguous. He wrote that Smith's actions were solely responsible for saving the aircraft and the lives of everyone remaining aboard it. The recommendation for the Medal of Honor moved through the chain of command with unusual speed. Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson was already scheduled to visit England in the summer of 1943, and arrangements were made for the decoration ceremony to take place at Thurley with appropriate ceremony. Reporters would be present. The Army Air Forces understood the value of the moment. The date was set for the 15th of July, 1943. On the morning of the ceremony, at the appointed hour, Maynard Smith could not be found. He was eventually located in the mess kitchen at Thurley, scraping leftover food from the metal breakfast trays of his fellow airmen. He had been assigned KP duty, kitchen police, the most undignified form of disciplinary work available to a military unit, because he had come in late from an unauthorized pass the previous evening and had apparently failed to note, or had failed to care, that his absence from the ceremony would be somewhat problematic. He was extracted from the kitchen, cleaned up sufficiently for a public appearance, and presented to the Secretary of War, who affixed the Medal of Honor to his chest in front of an audience of reporters and airmen. Andy Rooney would remember this moment for the rest of his long career. He wrote about it in his 1995 memoir, describing Smith with characteristic directness as a man whose physical presence gave no indication of the events of the 1st of May. Rooney noted, with the amused affection of a reporter who had found an irresistible story, that the ceremony's headline practically wrote itself. It ran in the stars and stripes under the words, "Medal of Honor winner found on KP." Smith flew 4 more combat missions after receiving the Medal of Honor. Then the 8th Air Force grounded him. The official reason was combat stress reaction, what would later be understood as post-traumatic stress disorder, though that terminology did not exist in 1943. Johnson, who had observed Smith closely on the 1st of May, believed the experience had affected him profoundly, describing the mission as having been traumatic in ways that lingered. Whatever the internal reality, Smith's behavior after the ceremony did not improve. He remained absent from duties he disliked. He clashed with superior officers. He spent his evenings in Bedford, where he had developed a small circle of English acquaintances willing to serve as an audience for his opinions. At a dance in Bedford, he met a 19-year-old USO hostess named Mary Rayner. They were married on the 15th of July, 1944, exactly 1 year after the Medal of Honor ceremony. Smith chose as his best man not a fellow airman but Mary's uncle. This detail, small as it is, speaks to something real about the nature of his relationships at Thurley. The productive tension between Smith and his unit's command structure came to its eventual conclusion on the 17th of December, 1944. The 306th Operations Officer, Major Thomas Witt, submitted a formal recommendation that Smith be reduced in rank from Staff Sergeant to Private. The justification was straightforward: poor job performance, chronic unavailability, repeated failure to respond to warnings and reprimands. The demotion was approved. On the same day, a medical review board permanently grounded him. On the 2nd of February, 1945, he was sent home to the United States. His hometown of Cairo, Michigan, received him in March of 1945 with a parade and a celebration that did not distinguish between the man as he was and the man as the decoration implied he should be. Smith was discharged from the Army on the 26th of May, 1945. The 3 men who jumped into the Bay of Biscay on the 1st of May, 1943, radioman Harry Bean and waist gunners Joseph Bukacek and Robert Folliard, were never found. They were listed as missing in action and eventually presumed dead. The waters of the Bay of Biscay are cold and the distances are large, and there was no air-sea rescue capacity adequate to that region in the spring of 1943. They made a rational choice and they did not survive it. This is not a judgment. The situation those three men faced was one in which any calculation of odds would have suggested the parachute was the better option. They had no way to know that the man they were leaving behind was going to hold the aircraft together for the next 90 minutes. They had no way to know that Lieutenant Johnson was maintaining control up front. They saw fire in two places at once, felt the structure shuddering, and made the decision that human beings in their situation typically make. The fact that Smith made a different decision does not mean he was wiser or more courageous in some general sense. It may mean he was less capable of the kind of rational fear assessment that leads most people to the hatch. It may mean that the same quality that made him impossible to live with in ordinary circumstances, the stubbornness, the refusal to accept the consensus view, the conviction that he was going to do things his way regardless of what anyone else thought, was precisely the quality the situation required. Roy Gibson, the tail gunner who had been shot through the back, survived the war. The morphine Smith had administered and the careful positioning that kept him from drowning in his own blood during the long flight home were not incidental to that survival. They were the reason for it. In the larger context of the 8th Air Force's war, the 1st of May, 1943, was one day among many hundreds. The 306th Bomb Group would fly 342 total missions from Thurley before the war ended, losing 171 B-17s in the process. The strategic bombing campaign that Smith's mission was a small part of would eventually, combined with ground operations and the efforts of Allied forces across multiple theaters, produce the result its architects had predicted: the systematic degradation of German industrial and military capacity to a point where continued resistance became unsustainable. The U-boat pens at Saint-Nazaire were never fully destroyed by aerial bombardment. The concrete was too thick, the penetrating power of the bombs available too limited. But the campaign against the U-boat infrastructure, of which the Saint-Nazaire missions were a part, contributed to conditions that shifted the Battle of the Atlantic decisively in the Allies' favor by the late spring and summer of 1943. German submarine losses in May of 1943 alone, the same month as Smith's mission, were catastrophic enough that Admiral Karl Donitz temporarily withdrew his U-boats from the North Atlantic. That decision effectively conceded the battle. Smith would not have known any of this. He knew that the aircraft was on fire, that men had jumped, that there was a wounded man who needed help, fires that needed fighting, German fighters that needed to be engaged, and ammunition that was cooking off in the heat. He worked on the problem in front of him with the tools available and the stubborn. Contrary will that was the defining quality of his character. The plane broke in half when it landed. The fuselage was too damaged to survive intact. It had been hit, as the subsequent count established, more than 3,500 times by bullets and shrapnel. That it flew at all, that it flew the distance it flew, that it brought back the men it brought back. This was a matter of specific, concrete actions taken by one man in the rear section who refused to treat the situation as hopeless. Maynard Smith spent the post-war decades in a manner consistent with his earlier life. He had legal troubles. He had difficulties with authority that did not end when the authority in question ceased to wear a uniform. He retired eventually to St. Petersburg, Florida, where he lived quietly and died on the 11th of May, 1984, at the age of 72. He is buried at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors, which is to say that the institution that demoted him and sent him home in semi-disgrace eventually acknowledged, in the only way that governments know how, what he had done on a burning aircraft over the Bay of Biscay 40 years earlier. The headstone at Arlington bears his name, his dates, and the notation of the Medal of Honor. It does not mention the KP duty. It does not mention the child support. It does not mention the nickname, or the pubs in Bedford, or the opinion that Major Witt eventually put on record about his job performance. These things are also true, and they are part of what makes the story worth telling. We tend to build our heroes smooth. We plane away the contradictions, fill in the uncomfortable gaps, construct a figure that suits the narrative we want. The brave man who was always brave, the selfless man who was always selfless, whose qualities in crisis are simply the expression of a character that was consistent and admirable throughout. This is a useful kind of story. It is also, almost always, false. Maynard Smith was not a good soldier in the conventional sense. He was not a good colleague, a good subordinate, or, by most evidence, a particularly good person in the years before and after the 1st of May, 1943. What he was, on that specific morning over the Bay of Biscay, in the rear of a burning B-17 with the crew gone and the fuselage on fire around him, was irreplaceable. The fires burned for nearly an hour and a half. He fought them. German fighters came back. He shot at them. A wounded man lay on the floor. He kept him alive. The extinguishers ran out. He used what he had. He threw burning things out of the aircraft and went back to the guns and went back to the fire and went back to the guns. Alone in the back of a broken, burning airplane, for as long as it took. There is no way to know, across the 80-odd years since that morning, what exactly went through his mind during those 90 minutes. He was not a man given to deep introspection, or at least not to sharing it. What the record shows is simply what he did, documented in Johnson's mission report, in Andy Rooney's reporting, in the official citation that the Secretary of War personally delivered, with Smith still smelling of the kitchen. He was peeling potatoes when they gave him the medal. He is buried at Arlington. He kept the initials of the decoration after his name until the end. If this story moved you, share it, because these are the histories that deserve to outlast the men who lived them. Subscribe for a new story every week, and thank you for watching.